All right, we're recording. It is 8 a.m. local time. I've got my coffee. I'm
It's like we're on an episode of Twin Peaks now.
half asleep still.
Diana, it's 8 a.m. I've got a hot cup of coffee. I'm in the Pacific Northwest.
That's right.
Listen, I'll tell you what I was thinking of as a continuation of our last week's topic on anti-intellectualism was the ways in which anti-intellectualism can masquerade as anti-emotionalism. Like, there's a lot of ways in which it's legitimate to protect yourself from people who are persistently stressful to you emotionally. Now, that's totally fair, but at the same time, there's a way of saying to people, because of your emotional demonstration, your ideas don't count. And it's one of the things that these classic books, like Hofstadter's book on anti-intellectualism, still had that classical notion that it was somehow freeing itself from emotion. But the exact critique of emotion that they put forward can be used by people to refuse ideas and then to refuse to have to grapple with those ideas and nuances. I find that very intriguing.
Yeah, there's a lot in there too, suggestive of this conflict between emotions and reason, right? So one of the classic examples is religious anti-rationalism, and that's somewhat necessarily there was the perception that science and religion are in conflict, right? And from one of the more recent articles that I've been reading, the distinction is made between warm emotion and cold reason. I thought that was useful, and also between absolutism and relativism. So there's a conflict there, and I think what you're suggesting is a little more complex in that it can go in all directions. So what it makes me think of, aside from my own situation, is like the Black Lives Matter protests, and well, just protests in general. It's like there's this condescension and patronizing attitude from elites towards the people, and saying like, oh, they have no clear message, or they're getting violent or whatever. And often that's either contrived, it's not true, or it's provoked. And so there's no effort on the part of the elites to hear the message of the people, or to translate it, right? Even if it is kind of compromised by emotion, right? And I think it's just as intellectual to learn how to listen to that.
Yeah, there's a big political component because you often hear people worried about anybody who is emotionally concerned about the political situation, as if that's a reason to be suspicious of what they're saying, right? Like, if you're motivated to support Bernie, or even back in the day, like Obama was not a very radical character. But I remember during his first election, a lot of people were concerned that his supporters were the Hitler Youth because they had some passion. Right? So at every scale of the system, there's this tendency to say, well, look, you guys care, and therefore you shouldn't be listened to. I mean, I see a lot in films as well. There's this argument sort of like, well, we can't make the new Star Wars movie for the Star Wars fans. They're excessive, right? We shouldn't really tailor it to the people who care the most. We should kind of tailor it to people who don't like it, or to the Chinese market, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a very systemic problem that we shouldn't really take seriously the people who are the most concerned on a topic.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of hypocrisy in general around this topic. Like, it's, there's like a kind of competitive stoicism, or shadow work, for that matter, to see who can process their emotions the best. But and those are the same people who mock it in other people, right? So like, I think of like Greta Thunberg. She had like at one point in particular a very emotional public display, as she was giving her speech, right? And a lot of right wingers just mocked that. And you know, those are both people who obviously probably are emotionally repressed and stunted, and but at the same time maybe people that think they're more morally evolved, you know, or that they know better. um so there's just a lot of hypocrisy around this.
I think people on the right, if we're going to use that concept still, tend to have a little bit more integration of aggression. So they're, they willfully give themselves permission to just be attackers. Whereas there's a strong thing on the institutional left of pretending that we don't have any aggression and that the aggressive people are the bad people. So we project our aggression onto them and then denounce them for being aggressive and don't notice that we're aggressing against them in the way that we frame the issue. I think that's a big difficulty, both in terms of the so-called left having that energy for itself to mobilize with, but also in order to avoid hypocrisy and see themselves with clear eyes. And we imagine there's these, like, the deplorables are out there, and the deplorables have all this unnecessary aggression. And what we have to do is stand back or chastise them or calm them down, right? And there are areas in which that's the case. You can't run an institution with everybody freaking out all the time, but that's also where the energy is for the system to change. That's the emotions of all the people, and that's some of the aggression and upset that we have to recall into ourselves in order to really feel what's going on and have the energy to mobilize.
Yeah, it is, or it becomes a very elitist tactic too, to kind of demonize the emotions or the emotional intelligence or lack thereof of people. And you know, it recalls an example from Hofstadter about you know, a teacher valuing the strict kind of rigid curriculum that was practical. And this is especially with like kindergarten and kids, and versus a parent who valued more creativity and also kind of a dynamic range of skills, including emotions and stuff like that. So it needs to be taught too, right? Like this is part of education. And so to advocate a very rigid, standardized, kind of rote educational system is also anti-intellectual, right? Regardless of how kind of scholastic and competitive you make it.
Yeah, if you set it up in a way that the intelligence isn't being grounded and embodied in the life, in the world, in the physiology and emotionality of the individuals, you're actually sabotaging their ability to be intelligent about things. You're confining it to a little stratum of cognitive capacity to rapidly recognize patterns. Then that's a legitimate form of intelligence, but you're minimizing the effect their intelligence could have upon themselves and the world. Right? You give them the opportunity to be available to the most superficial level of cognitive dissonance. Like, let's join the debate club, and I'm open to switching positions. I could take any side. I become a tactical thinker, but I'm not really open to the same interperspectival sensations at the level of my own heart. So I can't really live a situation that's beyond cognitive dissonance. I can speak to it. I can recognize it in ideas. I can pride myself on being Taoistically flexible, but I can't really bring that intelligence into the world. So I think you're right. There's a lot of education systems which promote the intellect, which are actually subtly anti-intellectual.
Yeah.
But you know what you mentioned the other day, that I'm curious about is this notion of people blocking people. Now, there's
Right.
legit reasons to block somebody. It's just too much for me right now, or they're legitimately being disruptive. But You know, I don't know anybody who's been blocked from things more than you have. So I'm sure you have some kind of insight into the systemic function of blocking, as well as just the authentic personal circumstance of blocking. What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, it's, as a phenomenon, it's pretty wide ranging, right? Like I can't make too many generalizations. Um like I there's definitely people who've been blocked more than I have. And there's people who have been, canceled and deplatformed, and that's a kind of way of like like permanently or comprehensively blocking, right? It's kind of a system-wide block. um but in my experience, I think it's a bad practice. I think it's counterproductive to the person who does it. Of course, the situations where it is valid is if you have somebody consistently harassing you, um like if they really fit a kind of description of a stalker, or they bully, then maybe it's within the bounds of reason. um but so if you're a public figure like Ben Shapiro, or whoever, like, I'm not blocked by Ben Shapiro. I've never taken a great deal of time to criticize somebody like him because he's so far away. But he's no doubt blocked a lot of people. If you're a public figure, though, you're disseminating information. You should expect legitimate critique, right? So when any type of person, right, and like we should be clear, like the people who have blocked me at one point or another, like, range from like very close to me to pretty much in the center, or a little bit to the right. And it's a type of self-denial that you're not only denying that critique, which if you're a good faith intellectual, you should want to let in, but you're denying whatever other information the person has, right? And it's especially hypocritical if you're one of these people, like the intellectual dark web type people, that you claim to be for, good faith conversation, um, all these sorts of things. Or you're open to changing your mind, because you can't expect these things to be easy, and you can't like expect um, people to believe you and take you seriously if you're the one blocking, right? So, like, I don't know if you know who Matt Iglesias is. He works for Vox, and he gets a lot of criticism from a lot of people. And at some point, I don't even remember when, maybe a year and a half ago, I was criticizing him on Twitter and he blocked me. And, I can get from his position, he probably is flooded with notifications and traffic from different people. So it makes sense at some point to just make a decision. Whether it's right or wrong is secondary to the kind of utilitarian aspect of it. So he makes a decision to block. But it's a Black Mirror kind of thing. There's even an episode about this. Like, when one person blocks the other, then it increases the polarization. It increases the scope of misunderstanding, right? And so, like in Black Mirror, all you can see is a kind of silhouette of the person. You don't even know who the person is. um but in this case, it's like, you know uh Matt Iglesias cannot see my work or my critiques, and I can't see his anymore. And it's really bizarre, because I see lots of other people, like quoting him and critiquing him. So I know that he's still making asinine takes on a regular basis and being critiqued and ignoring those critics. And I pick him out because, like he's, a liberal, ostensibly somebody closer that I could get through to. But no, so this speaks to not just the hypocrisy, but I think the rightward drift of a lot of people and that's underpinned by neoliberalism ultimately. And so on a more personal practical level, I'm currently blocked by Benita Roy and Jonathan Rowson, two very esteemed, respected people in the emerge community, and I have to kind of ask and think aloud, like, do they think that's the right decision? Is everybody better off? Are they better off? Am I better off? Is this really what we want to do? Because this is obviously, in a way, feeds back into my critique. It makes my critique all the more true. And it begs all these questions like, well, what are the emotional considerations that should be being made on both sides? Where are the mediators? But and of course there's many other people, David Fuller, now Schmachtenberger, and Jordan Hall. And I think there's no question, it's absolutely their loss. Because I was following their work, getting some value, but also being sufficiently not triggered, but just concerned about the mistakes in their work, and being sufficiently transgressed by them or their sycophants, or their fans or their interlocutors. And it's like this is text in a way kind of textbook anti-intellectual from intellectuals. So this is why I don't block anybody, but it also, in fairness, like, I don't have a large enough profile to kind of be critiqued on a regular basis. But even if I did, this is a principle thing. I don't think I have any really controversial takes. I try to take the meta perspective, and I'm willing to defend all my work and my takes, right? So if I was in their shoes and somebody issued a critique, regardless of how, kind of attacking I perceived it to be, I would be inclined to address it. So, I think this feeds back into the very anti-intellectual culture we live in, even among intellectuals.
I think there is an interesting parallel between what goes on with people in their individual communication channels and what goes on at bigger levels of the socioeconomic system. Like when I was a kid, it was always really interesting to me how much graffiti seemed to be a personalized paralleling of corporate advertising in public space. And there's a similar pattern that might go on between individuals blocking each other and deplatforming as a social phenomenon. That's probably worth people having a look at their impulse to block to see what's legit and what's not legit in that. Now, of course, it's a tricky balance, right? We're always looking at, do I have enough time, and am I getting energy out of this interaction? Like everybody knows, probably some family members who you're connected to them, you love them, but every time you get a message from them, it's just more shit you got to deal with, to the point where you're exhausted and you think, I just can't. I know there's something valid there, but it's just too much. I can't deal with it for my own mental health. So on the one hand, people have the right to do that and probably should do that, probably a little more freely than they should have less angst about it, I think. But at the same time, we do want to be open to critique, and the ones we want to be open to the most are the ones that bug us a little. And we need to, I think, as a community, start practicing anti-fragility skills. So we want to lean into those things a little bit, and rather than gate ourselves off from it.
Yeah, I just to add here, I was actually blocked 2 days ago by a random Twitter account, right? And it's funny because sometimes I see on Twitter, somebody will post that they got blocked by somebody they didn't even know. So there's like these preemptive blocks, like somebody who is like right-wing provocateur or troll. They have some bad takes. They can anticipate who's going to critique them, so they block in advance. But this isn't one of those cases, but it's similar. So this account called the Human Experience Podcast, and it's a podcast, and they have like 70,000 followers or something on Twitter. And so it's already established, but I get this, and they've had like 200 some odd guests, and some of them very notable and some of them kind of quacks. So it's, they brand themselves as like, oh, the best of the best. And of course, this is typical of these intellectual cultures like big think and stuff like that. Like, there's a lot of back patting. And, as a kind of sociological intellectual, I just find it kind of repulsive. But anyways, this podcast sends me a message, and it's a long message. And I'm like, oh, what's this? And very quickly I can tell that it's like a kind of stock message. It's not personalized. But I look at it, and what strikes me is that ultimately all it was a request to give us a positive review. So it's a solicitation, and it's like, okay, I've done that before, in my kind of desperate attempts to market myself, right? And it's always, I never think of it as I'm imposing on the other person. It's an offer. Here's an offer. I mean, I wouldn't be asking for a review. I'd be inviting to something more concrete. But so I get this message, and I reply, oh, I thought this was an invite for a second, but I see that it's just spam. Right. So that's my reply. It's a little bit, snarky. But it's not wrong. and I get the reply. It says, you're right, just spam. And of course the guy is not, like appreciating my critique and reflecting it back to me, because it was immediately followed by a block. So it was just sarcastic, like, you're right, just spam, and then I'm blocked. And I was, I'm just thinking, like, good for you, pal. Good for you. Like, and this, again, I don't even know this person or this account. And this speaks to what I'm talking about. Like, this podcast wouldn't not be the type to have me as a guest, because I'd be critical. I'd say, oh, you got some great people on, but you also got some cranks, and what are you doing? And, how does this speak to the meta crisis? And, I'd want to go into all that type of stuff. So I wanted to tell that little anecdote. But there's also, there's exceptions. So, Jim Rutt is somebody who blocked me at times for his own posterity or whatever. But eventually, ultimately he kept open some channels, and ultimately I reached out, I persisted, and he's agreed to have me on his podcast, right? So I'm scheduled to be on his podcast in October. Still a ways away, but the good faith is there. And there was a lot of, like, it's funny because he's one of the people I clashed with the most, because I think that's in his character. But I also kind of saw through that and thought, we can make appeals to each other on intellect alone, and on the potential for overcoming the bullshit, right? So I was calling him out on the hypocrisy and saying, if we're both good faith, then we can do this. So so that's good, but it shouldn't be so hard. And this is one of the things that both of us hope to demonstrate. I think that we need to do better.
What do you make of people who call for Trump's comments and Trump supporters to be blocked or deplatformed or removed from certain communication spaces?
It really depends. I mean, there's people, and Sam Cedar is one of them. He'll say, I'm not a free speech absolutist, right? Like, he's for free speech, obviously, but you got to have a little nuance. So when I say it depends, there's people who ultimately have clearly transgressed the terms of service and been deplatformed, like Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, and Alex Jones for another. And I have a pretty high tolerance for bullshit and for provocateurs. So as much as I disdain them, I'd hate to be the one making the ruling, because you have to justify it. At the same time, I don't lose any sleep over them being deplatformed, especially in Alex Jones's case. Like, he is super rich. And he's just at this point in his career for many years now, he's just not a sincere actor. He's literally an actor. He's literally a bad actor. So I think what's important is when these people get deplatformed, that we understand why, and that it's justified. So I'm all for it, but the sad part is, like, that's the least we can do. The more serious thing is, like, so cancel culture is, like, really, I think, kind of lame and tepid as an example of kind of retribution, because it's like, you're just being judged in the court of public opinion, and fine, so what? I mean, occasionally the wrong people get sort of beat up out there, but in their cases, like, they brought it on themselves. But what I'm getting at is, for people who gain a certain level of clout or social power or notoriety, there's you just, like, they're never going to get in that serious trouble. Like, if you're rich, you can just hire lawyers and get off. So that speaks to the fundamental injustice in society. Is, there's all these people like Trump himself, who's so criminal in his, like, professional activity, that he should be in jail for one form of white collar crime or another. But instead of that, almost everybody without fail, and this speaks to, like, the Me Too kind of crisis and all these sorts of things, that powerful people can just slip through the cracks and protect each other and exonerate each other. So it becomes a very dark, self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, I tend to be a very much an idealist and sort of hardliner when it comes to, like, I advocate truth and reconciliation. I think Bush and Cheney and many other people should be prosecuted for war crimes. But these are to most people, very unrealistic scenarios.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, the people who, like, in the supposed meritocracy, where maximizing your share of the resource flows and insulating yourself from feedback sort of counts as merit. People who have that kind of merit can survive almost any turbulence. So even if they were to get attacked or temporarily deplatformed, it doesn't really make a significant difference to their lives. So they've got a certain kind of structural privilege in that sense. But some of them also, like, one of the interesting things about Trump is he has this style of courting controversy. Now, he's also seemingly a fragile, reactive person in many respects. But I think as we move forward into the internet age, and as we try to build social strength on the part of meta-progressives, we have to be looking at this question of how we welcome upsetting public communication, right? The old days, it was, the scandal was leaked, and then you go on TV with your wife and you thank Jesus and you resign, right? That's kind of gone now, right? You can pull up a video of somebody from 3 months ago of them saying the exact opposite, and it doesn't really damage what they're saying at the moment. So we're sort of rolling into not exactly the post-truth era, but a hyper-semantic situation in which all information is dubious, and you're going to be constantly confronted by upsetting and ambiguous signals. So how do we, strengthen ourselves as individuals, as communicators, and also our political agents, strengthen them so that they can benefit from, rather than be weakened by upsetting things, provocations, right? How do we have a good attitude about what seems like slander? How do we have a good attitude about what bugs us emotionally? How do we have a way of rolling into our project whatever crazy thing we hear, because we're guaranteed to hear crazy shit now in this new information medium?
Yeah. Um, there's a lot of pressure or incentive, um, if I'm optimistic, to, lead by example. And there's also this desire to, consolidate the left so it can actually take power. And I think it would require very unconventional risks and, acts of, let's say, self-flagellation and metanoia, really. And so, like, Obama, who you mentioned, is one of these figures who, he's got a ton of charisma and potential and flexibility somewhat in his mentality. And so, he um, got elected on a very like transformational promise, but completely failed to deliver, even though the kind of leftist grassroots sentiment was there, right? And these are the people that wanted to, they want to save the world. And so Obama was a lame duck. But he continues to just live that stereotype instead of transforming, and I think what's needed is, like, for him to really change, really be a radical. But clearly what happens, and it goes back to anti-intellectualism, is as you work up the chain and you become powerful, you become embedded in networks of power, you become, less appreciative of this idealism. You become much more compromising, and perhaps this happens with age too. He's just getting more conservative. But the type of leadership we actually need is not Obama. It's Obama plus. Like, because Obama is now, deferring to Biden, who's, kind of in some ways reducible to Trump. Like, people call it blue MAGA. And that's what the right-wing Democrat establishment has become, just this machine of selling out. And so, if we're gonna, if people like Bonita Roy are gonna use this both sides fallacy, obviously it's somewhat true in the case of the immediate left and right, in that the establishment left and right. But we need to, completely throw out that bathwater, right? And save the baby, which is the Bernie politics. And so, to bring it back to anti-intellectualism again, right? It's like, there was a lot of that weaponized against the Sanders movement, and the holier than thou intellectual stuff, like, oh, I know better, or, oh, I used to be a Sanders supporter in 2016. And Jim Rudd is one of these people, and he's also a person that said, like, he hates postmodernism, he hates spirituality, and he claimed Bernie was a state socialist, and he claimed he was going to criticize the Green New Deal, which he didn't. like a systematic takedown. And so this is an actual kind of anti-intellectual defense to say like that, I'm smarter than that stuff. But it's ironic because what generates that grassroots power and Bernie Sanders' career is actually a kind of intellectualism that's above reproach, you know, that, it's not infallible, but it's pretty consistent. It's demonstrably true. Bernie marched with Martin Luther King. He's been on the right side of history his entire life, but conservatives and liberals engage in a kind of historical revisionism that says, no, actually, Biden marched with Martin Luther King, and Bernie is just a troublemaker, right? Which is not true on either account. So, this starts to get under the surface of something we talked about before we started recording, which was the meta crisis. The ongoing, deep-rooted, ancient meta crisis, in fact.
Yeah, I'm reminded of what I was saying earlier about anti-emotionalism as a facade for anti-intellectualism, right? Because you mentioned the Sanders campaign, and that was one of the arguments, right? Look at these, the concept of the Bernie bro, or even the more extended, diverse concept of Sanders supporters often seems suspect to people precisely because they were enthusiastic about it. But there's this other part of that campaign, that moment when Bernie drops out, and a number of people say, look, I'm not necessarily on board with Joe Biden. In fact, he looks like, to me, he represents what's been going wrong in the system for decades. Now, of course, better than Trump, but they're coming forward with this argument, and there was a tremendous backlash against those people, right? And there's something, I'm sure you would probably see an anti-intellectual movement in that backlash, because they're trying to shut down the thinking of those people. I mean, just as it's getting started, they're trying to feel out where they're at in that situation and articulate their feelings on the subject so they can move forward to a more complex position. But the sense that that represents an intolerable danger that we just have to shut down, and that the danger consists primarily of people saying things, is very suspicious to me. Because, I mean, one of the things you see everywhere now is that speech is treated as action, right? And there's a fine line, right? If somebody sends you a death threat, that's in a different category. But we see all these things like, Jordan Peterson destroys reporter, or whatever, right? And they just mean that he said something, witty or in rebuttal to their remark. And the internet is full of these things where just making a comment is treated as if it was some sort of sufficient and overwhelming action, whether it was overwhelming action on the part of one of your defenders trouncing a ridiculous accusation, or whether somebody said something to you and it's unacceptable because it's just speech. It's very strange that we're really, now maybe this is ancient. I'm sure our ancestors, if a voice in the sky said, I'm your God, why would you believe a voice in the sky? Just because it said so to speak. We're all a little bit gullible relative to speech acts. But there seems to be a big anti-intellectualism problem in treating speech as if it was activity, both positively and negatively.
Yeah. And you're right. It's definitely anti-intellectual, but it's also one of these things that is sort of predetermined or overdetermined by the structure, because if people don't have the education, then they won't know any better. And I mean the education up to that level, right? Because I didn't learn anything about critical thinking and semantics and linguistics, which is what we're touching on, and the social construction of it all, until university, right? And not everyone has access to that. And for good reason, the anti-intellectual sentiment was often between ordinary people and academics and universities, because of the alienation it creates, the distance between these kind of egghead pursuits and the concerns of ordinary people. And so, it comes back to this idea of the meta crisis. And we were touching on how, as much as we admire Hofstadter and the book, and it's very much an avant-garde product of its time, it falls short to meet contemporary needs and describe the meta crisis, which is this deeply nested thing that reproduces itself through these games, language games and academic games and power and status games, that, it's fundamentally just humans trying to get on with each other. We're just trying to survive rather than, you know, actually conceive of long-term survival. And so when we get into that frame and realm, it's far from simple. Like, there, that can be anti-intellectual too. If you just think of like the game B people who really just think almost exclusively about species survival and planetary resilience and stuff, to the expense of what's going on in politics, and they try, they try a little bit to comment, but it just comes across as very detached, no skin in the game, and no receptivity to critique and to, like, the real critical or progressive perspectives. They make a kind of hyper-pluralist move like Emerge does, to kind of just hear all perspectives, and in an elitist way, very elitist, right? To be sure, they place themselves above so that they can make those determinations for everybody. So, I mentioned to you too, I want to bring up just to this notion of the meta crisis, like it's a deep rooted ongoing thing. But Peter Lindbergh has been using it as if we're in the meta crisis now, because it's to him, at least in his circles, it's become publicly salient. And so, I noted in my meta convergence article that there's actually, according to a Scientific American article, there's 4 convergences, and we could kind of consider this as indicative of a meta crisis coming online. And those are the economic and ecological collapse juxtaposed with the pandemic and the protests. These are all kind of intersecting things, and so Peter and others are alluding to this idea that we're in the meta crisis now. That, and maybe it's this window where the deep-rooted meta crisis is made salient, but at the same time it kind of fetishizes the concept. So the way I use the term is much more deep-rooted, looking for those like Archimedean points of leverage where we can completely change the system, right? So we need to, like, not just deliberate and pontificate about these things, but actually, throw into reverse all those processes that are unfolding.
There's definitely something a little bit faddish and a little bit hopeful about thinking of the current moment as the exemplar of the meta crisis, right? And it's partly something that always happens to leftist tendencies. Is you always feel like this is the moment, the revolution is
Yeah.
starting now, it's finally going to happen.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that.
But at the same time, I think the bigger concept of the meta crisis has a past, present, and future element. Like I was saying before we started, we're kind of in the foyer of the meta crisis. It is coming into view for some people more intensely now, but it also has a history. It's been generating itself all along. It's been generating, like I was saying, it's been generating itself in the solutions to the actual crises. You solve a crisis and you credit that person or that system for doing that, but the unresolved issues, they move forward to a convergence point, and they continually do this to create that meta crisis. but also it has a future. We ain't seen nothing yet, right? When you think of is the weirdness of mass instability of the moment, this could be an extremely nice moment compared to what's coming, right?
Yes.
When the tides are really rising, when those nuclear warheads start going off. So we can't really use this as the triumphant example of what's going on, but it could be
Yeah.
something that gives people a bit of the flavor of what is starting to come forward now.
Yeah, exactly. Um, I wanted to bring back a few things we touched on and kind of make an integration. This isn't the ideal time to segue, but I just I don't know where else to go. I wanted to mention, going back to my idea of consensus building. There's a lot of different, topics I want to build consensus around, and a lot of different cohorts I want to try it with. But just as an example, and to touch on the emotional element that creates cognitive dissonance for people. Ideally, I'd want to construct this as a social experiment so comprehensively, like so overdetermined to counteract the overdetermination of these problems, right? So let's say I want to take a bunch of flat earthers and build consensus around a spheroid Earth. There's many steps that would have to take place, right? And they'd have to really consent to the whole process. But I bring up this example because obviously people who are flat earthers, there's an emotional entanglement of with the ideology itself, right? So you'd need to de-escalate that. You'd need to create a space, whether it's separate or within that consensus building, to process their emotional resistance to the information, right? And a lot of these things are coupled with other conspiracy theories, it's part of me there's an example I want to bring up it's a video with a flat earther, and part of me wants to think that it's all just that it was like a kind of performance and it's a kind of satire. but the other part of me knows that these truth is stranger than fiction. There's a lot of dumb, vulnerable people out there. And so this flat earther said that the way into flat earth theory for him was actually 9/11 conspiracy theories. So that was the rabbit hole that led to the dumbest kind of uh, the dumbest kind of apex of magical thinking, which is flat earth. So again, I bring that as a kind of crude example. I'd love to take 100 flat earthers and convert them to spheroid earth theory. And you're not going to do that at a flat earth convention where they're all incentivized to double down. But I believe it's possible. And so this is just a crude example, but I want to build consensus around these much more subtle topics, right? And I think it's the same fundamental structures of thinking and blocking that that actually prevent consensus from forming. And this is very central to the meta crisis for me, and to this idea of anti-intellectualism, because I mean, think of any experts in any field, right? Like economists or whatever, obviously they have a hard time building consensus. It's not clear that any of them even try. And maybe they think it's impossible because the field is too complex. There needs to be this high level of diversity and ambiguity. But as the meta crisis intensifies, it becomes more evident to me that there are some simple attractors and vectors that we should be able to build consensus around. And so with respect to economics, donut economics strikes me as a good example, because fundamentally all you're saying is, we have to have a social floor and ecological ceiling. Who's really going to disagree with that? And if econometricians want to make some fancy formulas, it doesn't necessarily need to be intelligible to the layperson, but it better fucking land within the boundaries of that donut, or else it's bad economics.
I think there are a lot of general principles that we probably could get convergent consensus agreement on. But you can't get that just by telling people. So you've got to go through a process of convergence, which depends on a prior process of mutual sense making, which in turn depends on trust, right? And like you're saying about the guy who goes down the 9/11 rabbit hole, right? His trust in modernity is shaken by an event. And so he begins to try out more embodied pre-modern styles of understanding. And why not? You look around and it looks flat, and why would you trust the system that's mismanaging the world? And if you have I'm always complaining about modernity's inability to regenerate itself, right? Modern schools typically don't give you the experiences and skills that actually generate modernity. They give you a semi-dogmatic readout of the consensus understanding of modernity at the moment that you're supposed to regurgitate. But in a way, that's no better than a pre-modern form of understanding. And if you catch sight of that, well, why not go flat earth then? If basically your modernity is dogmatic, why not just take up a dogma?
Yeah.
But that's all based on this emotional component, right? That they're not trusting any of the institutions. They're not trusting any of the systems. And maybe that's legit in terms of that scale. But when we're dealing with each other, we also have to set up these trust relationships. People have to feel like their cares and concerns are acknowledged by the other to some degree, so that they can engage in the sense making that can move forward to the convergence. So, like, I know you're bringing forward a lot of interesting critiques. Do you worry that you're not doing the trust creating part well enough? That you're not letting people know that you value their cares and concerns so that they can get on board? Or do you think it's more fundamentally an irrational response in them, or both?
I think it's more the latter. And, I wouldn't say that if I couldn't defend it, right? Because there's elements in all my critiques, including the intellectual dark web, which I'm probably the most critical of. It's my punching bag. Um, where I say, this is what they're right about. This is what they're good at. And, ostensibly we agree on the same Enlightenment principles. But I argue that the left I speak with and identify with actually defends those principles better, right? And these are the pockets of the left that are typically ignored, both by the establishment media and this alternative media, right? So the Weinsteins can go on and on about their distributed information suppression complex, but they are certainly part of it themselves. They're a very exclusive kind of pundit sphere, and I think that's partly intentional. I think it's partly accidental. Um, and then there's the question of like, well, okay, well, I've tried, but what could I do better? And again, it kind of comes back to this emotional elitism, if you will, that like, oh, the protesters have to say it in a way that maintains my elite status, or else I'm not going to hear it. This is anti-intellectual, and it's counterproductive. So I'll say all that, but I wanted to touch on trust too. Like, it's such an important point, and because structurally the trust has been eroded from society, and to renew it, or to establish it for the first time rather, there needs to be a full spectrum transformation in society where there's full investment in all the sectors, the public sectors that scaffold and facilitate this trust, right? So we live in such capitalist realism, it's still hard to actually even imagine that. but there's a lot of naysayers and skeptics and nihilists out there that have done their homework somewhat of human history, and they say, well, no, this is an inevitable track that we're stuck on. Things are just going to keep getting worse because it's built into the system. But what is different, what is unique, and what is novel is the internet, right? The internet, polarizes on one hand, but on the other hand, it inverts that logic on its head, because it maps the entire globe, and it gives us a kind of panoptic, omniscient perspective. And coming back to this idea of a voice in the clouds or the bush, like talking to you, if you really listen, the reality is speaking to us, right? And so the internet is going to unite us all in the end, because it has to. This is how we're going to start to break down and reconstruct trust through the post-truth crisis, right? Because this post-truth crisis just seems to be deepening, and we need to reverse it. And a big part of my work, and I think that it's meta-modern, and it needs to be integrated by postmodernists and their critics, is autocritique, right? So not only do I acknowledge what is correct and true about those that I critique, I value this notion of autocritique, which is actually, it goes back to the 70s. It's a little bit embedded in the postmodern discourse, but it's rare, right? And it's this idea of self-criticism, and I try to take it further. I'm trying to develop it into not just self-criticism, but the kind of meta critique. And so, like, in the way that we're criticizing Hofstadter, we're not criticizing him necessarily or the book itself, but the structure that enables the continuation of the meta crisis, right? So the arrival of Hofstadter's book in the 60s is this kind of threshold, where things were just going to get more radical after that. And Hofstadter was a liberal, not a radical, and he's sort of consolidating this very lucid picture for elites and masses alike, to say, look, there's this anti-intellectual trend, and it's bad, and intellectuals have a very special task to kind of see through the matrix and be reformist. But in hindsight, also, he was a bit negligent of race and gender, and how those things are historically intertwined, and that our modern failures are contingent on that paradox. So if Hofstadter was really taking the meta perspective, if he was around today, or he wrote a sequel, or if he was just more radical of his time, the book might not have landed, might have not have won a Pulitzer Prize, but it would have got deeper into the meta crisis and how these problems get reproduced. And so I come back to what I'm talking about with, like, full spectrum transformation. Like, 8 billion people, every single one of them has full universal healthcare, full universal education, UBI, jobs guarantee as well, right? So there's a optionality and flexibility around that, built within various global Green New Deals, and so on and so forth. This is, and then we start to plug into metamodernism and all these high-minded, pragmatic ideas that we have.
Yeah, when you think about metamodernism or integral politics or anything like that tries to take a postmodernist or trans-postmodernist stance that includes pre-modern and modern, I think from that point of view, you still have to really emphasize what is the minimum level of progressive upgrade necessary in order to get that kind of a culture off the ground, right? Like, how much green do you need in order for teal to really start operating? It's a good integral question. So I think there's people that want to take higher perspectives really need to figure out for themselves what kind of minimum progressive upgrades to the socioeconomic order are necessary in order for what they're saying to have any tractability at all going forward. I like what you say about autocorrect. For me, there's a big issue around seeing and feeling your own contradictions in order to mobilize your own development. It's very easy to think about cognitive development in terms of the number of patterns and the range of types of patterns you're capable of recognizing. And it's really nice to be in a life where you can have a new idea and see a new pattern, and that's great, and you just go from victory to victory. But there's a much deeper kind of stage-like development that goes on when you are really interested in the gaps between your behavior and your principles. And that's an old one, right? That's remorse as an esoteric religious tactic. It's something that we need in politics, because so many people are so insulated from what goes on that when their idea turned out to be wrong, they don't have to change. They don't have to confront it. There's no self-reflection.
Yeah.
There's very little self-reflection going on anywhere. And that somehow really living through that contradiction in yourself and asking yourself about it, that's the key to making this engine start to function and take us forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, Hillary Clinton was a name that popped into my head as somebody who has completely rejected that principle. Like these people will always stop short of, of acknowledging wrongdoing, and they'll never, prematurely apologize. It's always when they get caught. you know, and so, Hillary Clinton, but also, countless other people we can invoke. But yeah, it speaks to this, anti-intellectualism, that no matter how smart you are, and valuing of expertise, that you will trade off, you will satisfice and compromise on values because you're calculating, you're thinking about the greater good. And because I'm kind of in a position where I have nothing to lose, that makes it a lot easier for me to say these sorts of things. Nevertheless, these are the principles that I'm trying to articulate, on a meta level, that I would be faithful to if I was in a position of power, right? So, it's easy to say, well, if I was in Obama's shoes or Trudeau's shoes, I would do so and so. And what I'm saying is that it's not just wishful thinking. Like, I really mean it, because I'm trying to crystallize those principles in a way that they scale, and in a way that, whatever consequences there would be, in terms of, like, oh, if I speak too much truth, it's going to piss off too many people, and then it's going to cause conflict and entropy in the system. The auto critique needs to go, further. This is a meta modern move. So you're doing some sort of integration that people will be incentivized to hear it and to integrate it themselves. So it's a tricky thing, but I'm saying, all these people should hold themselves to a higher standard, and be aware of what happens as you become elite. Like, when I was a student, I viewed elitism in pretty neutral, kind of meritocratic terms. And I had this professor who's very critical, and I would say to him, like, oh, I want to be elite. Like, that's why I'm, like, getting an elite degree, and I want to, um, uh, uh, you know, um, be a part of this aristocracy, so to speak. I wanted to be a diplomat or something like that. But he busted that myth for me, and I'm forever transformed by it, right? Just by seeing the critical truth that he deployed to undo that myth. Just caused me to rethink it. And so now I no longer care. Like, I'm not attached to that type of elitism, right? Which is married to careerism and professionalism, and all these sorts of expectations and norms for happiness, and what is socially acceptable. And I think it's very clear that type of elitism that I'm now criticizing is failed. It's absolutely failed to in any way insert itself underneath and subvert the meta crisis from unfolding. It becomes kind of co-opted into power and business as usual, and that is precisely what is killing us.
Yeah, I would agree that it's, I mean, its world space or its time frame, whatever we're talking about there, is too small to address these things that occur in a historical context and are unfolding and accumulating and predicted to emerge in the future, right? It's very tied to the quarterly report or this year's election, or it has a kind of small window, and there's things it definitely can't solve. And that's the kind of reckoning that is needed. We were talking about the auto critique. It has to see, Jordan Hall had this great line about how the blue system just thinks it can do things that it actually can't do, right? It also, people think they mean things that they don't mean. The system can't really get a hold of a whole bunch of things that it thinks it has command of. The kind of incrementalist response to healthcare and ecology is just not going to solve the problem at all. It's not even a proposal at the level of the speed at which the problem is unfolding. It's not
Yeah.
in that same game board at all. And so it has to confront that about itself in order to start to move somehow. And that means we have to create, in addition to a sense-making and convergence-oriented ethos, we have to create an ethos in which we want to confront those things. We're really curious. We have a positive attitude about finding our own weak spots, blind spots, self-contradictions. Where am I failing? Where are my ideas not really my ideas? Where are my values the opposite of my values? Where am I behaving in contradiction to the principles I congratulate myself on holding? We have to really have a positive attitude about that and exchange that positive attitude. Otherwise, we're not going to unlock the energy we need in order to get the project underway.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I do think I'm doing that. Of course, I'm open to critique. I'm open to being being a little bit wrong and reformist. At the same time, I'm not one of these people out there as a guru saying you need to do shadow work, like David Fuller, to pick on him, or Jordan Hall, who's saying, blah, 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 right relationship, rule omega. When I see his behavior online, I think he completely does not follow his own rules. And maybe from his perspective, he thinks he's trying. But, my critique was more against Game B as a whole, because it's got this nice juxtaposed framing, like, oh, there's Game E and there's Game A and there's Game B. And then what you see in practice is a lot of Game A behavior masquerading as Game B. And so it undoes the entire metaphor. And so again, I'm trying to just advocate these novel ideas of auto critique and convergence and consensus building, because it's precisely the people in these positions of leadership and of one form of power or another that have the most leverage for change, and that they're afraid of what trade-offs there will be, you know, like, oh, if I say this, is it gonna, you know, piss off my audience, which is, you know, unfortunately mostly right wing or centrist? Or is there a way I can do it that they will come with me on the change, right? And, you know, still in my mind, there's so few examples of people who make that switch. You know, people tend to more or less be on the tracks they're on for life. And this I find very disturbing. I try not to do that. But you know, Joe Biden's one of these people, like, and so is Hillary Clinton. They just they ride the wave of where the public is at, and they'll change when they get the public pressure and not before. But I think these people truly have nothing to lose. Like, what does Jeff Bezos have to lose other than his his gold chains, so to speak? You know, he's disgustingly rich. And you know, I also think of like Oprah Winfrey, and you know, she spent a number of years promoting The Secret. The Secret was an incredibly anti-intellectual project, right? As a kind of movement and book and pseudo documentary. And you know, Oprah Winfrey is a self-made Black woman, like a self-made, successful, enormously rich and powerful. But you know, you never see you know, that real deep transformation from people like her, and anybody in that position. You know, Ellen's another good example, because she's a talk show host, right? And very self-made. And you know, her way of rising above is to make friends with George W. Bush. And I think again, from an intellectual perspective, that's just such an obscene thing to do. Like Bush is not a dumb person, but he was a very anti-intellectual president. And there's research, substantive research, about how these leaders actually weaponize that, right? They're consciously using it, and Trump is consciously doing it, right? Like, it's just such a red herring to, you know, just write him off as dumb, but certainly anti-intellectual. And so, you know, for Ellen to, you know, kind of you know, whitewash and endorse Bush, and you know, now all the you know, all these neocons are endorsing Biden, and so it's just this big sort of circle jerk. It really reinforces the meta crisis. And so this is why I've been so critical from a constructive place of Integral, of IDW, of Game B, of Emerge, because I think they've got a lot of strengths and good practices and conceptual frameworks, and but so do I, and I've got the more reflexive part of it on lock, you know, and the self-effacing part and the self-sacrificing part, that if, you know, if people would just try a little bit harder, they could do a whole lot better.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. We're looking towards some kind of consensus between people who have different temperaments and different takes on the situation. But we're also looking at a situation where there's, in many respects, too much agreement, too much getting alongness among people,
Yeah.
and then priding themselves on that, when it creates a sort of a false level of congeniality, which locks in the governing system that is continuing to control us, but also falling apart before our eyes. So it's very tricky. When you look at people like Oprah, is interesting because, you know, if she promotes something that's anti-intellectual, is it because it supports her role in sort of a liberal economic establishment? Yes. But also there's a little bit of this thing that the right-wing conservative element of progressive thought has not really been appreciated or integrated properly. And we know that we have to go forward in a way that integrates that a little more. And some of the things on the right, you know, like the Jordan Peterson as the epitome of this situation, right? Which is, he actually has a lot of things in common with postmodernism, but he also has some problematic elements. But what he brings that really excites people is this sort of self-help and coaching element,
Right.
right? And for Oprah as well, like The Secret, as much as it's pre-rational rather than trans-rational,
Right.
comes across to you like it's giving you some life coaching. And my take as a Canadian on American politics is they really want to elect a coach of some kind, right? That's part of what the Trump thing was. That Trump was the author of a book on how to be Trump, right?
Yeah.
He thought, well, if he could tell me how to be like him, it would be clear sailing. If only I could get Arnold Schwarzenegger in there, or somebody has some kind of embodiment and some orientation to tell me how I can be more successful. And I don't think we've seen that from a president for a very long time. And I think that's one of the important things that the right-leaning element of the progressives have to bring to us, whether we call it spirituality or we call it just personal developmental maturation. They're really crying out for some kind of help in their own lives so that they can get on track with the sociological thing.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that. However, the thing that occurs to me right at the end, especially, is how the self-help discourse is just a cop-out, right? It's a bunch of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and it becomes a marketable, saleable piece of merchandise. And again, that's anti-intellectual in a kind of dangerous way. And so, I mean, I agree with you that we need more people who have that coach spirit and um like physically embody these ideals, if possible, like Arnold. Like, obviously Trump doesn't, he's just a blob. But um um the self-help thing, if you're if you're a serious thinker, and I hope a serious conservative would grok this, but especially almost any leftist would, that it's all just lip service and kind of doublespeak if you don't have the structure, right? The welfare state, the programs to enable that. So, by all means, give the inspirational speeches and the self-help tools, but for fuck's sake, fund it and, provide the structural scaffolding. And so, I mean, all of this comes back to the idea of a paradigm shift, which for me is not incremental, right? There's incremental elements that build up to it and create that tipping point. But the paradigm shift itself is not a bunch of endless tweaking. So, modern monetary theory is something I've written about. Those articles are forthcoming, and even though I started the articles 5 months ago, there's been a cascade of articles and discourse around this topic, because it provides a kind of economic leverage to achieve a paradigm shift, to pay for it. How are we going to pay for it? But of course, it's a complex conversation, because opening up that faucet also invites a lot of instrumental anti-intellectuals, people who just want to take advantage. And that's why MMT is being used now to bail out private industry, right? Like, it shouldn't be, but that's what we're seeing happen. And the paradigm shift would be, the public bailout. So again, the Green New Deal, and to use Bratton's phrase, greener New Deals. We need a broad coalition of these initiatives, and a meshwork of them. But so what we're trying to do is the prefigurative mental work to achieve that paradigm shift sort of overnight, right? And I keep pushing for us to accelerate the groundwork process. So we need to start having more conferences. Like, conceivably, we could have weekly conferences where we kind of have a with our networks, a kind of a brain trust and a kind of think tank to build out that process, right? So this isn't just a sharing circle, but we actually have a constructive mutual agenda to rapidly iterate these different sort of metasystemic frameworks that we're working with.
Yeah, when it comes to um, the systemically biased version of self-help, I think that has a lot to do with the way that right and left operate at different operating systems, right? So if we look at, the self-help version of liberal modernity is going to reinforce liberal modernity, including reinforcing the privilege of anyone who's privileged in that system. So what we want to do is be able to tease the modern right apart from the progressive right. Just like I've been talking a lot about progressives needing to come to a self-awareness of their difference from liberals and the left, so to speak, right? And that really applies because we really want to hear from and integrate the energy from conservative progressives, because there's a lot of them out there and they're very keyed into the economic situation. They have a lot of moral energy to mobilize, and they've been co-opted by all kinds of other people who aren't serving their interests, and we need that energy. So we need to do that. When it comes to regular meetings and conferences, we're already initiating regular meetings with us. There need to be more people, but there also needs to be some kind of way of tracking it or inscribing the conclusions that we're at in a given moment. Because yes, this fluid mutual sense-making process does something, and over time it builds up a common spirit. But also, there's no, at the end, where are we on the issues and how do we rank them? And,
Yeah.
how would we vote? That kind of thing. What's the
Yeah.
platform? And how do we mark that at the end of each session so that
Yeah.
we know where we're going or not?
Yeah. Another integration I want to make kind of builds off what you're saying is, and it just recalls this constant theme in my thinking, that there's a hyper specialization sort of crisis, right? And so the problems are over determined, but the solutions are also over researched. And so so we can list off the hundreds of social issues that we want to effectively solve, not just mitigate, but solve. Like, and I always think of something like homelessness, right? Because it's just such a moral failure, and very, very taxing reality, not just on the individual who's homeless, but on the system. And so my point with that is, though, like, if you find a real expert, right, not a kind of demagogue or pseudo intellectual on the issue, but if you search for that consensus, there's certainly solutions, and there's micro solutions, and then there's always, what I appreciate more is the kind of systemic solutions that say, oh well, homelessness is a function of this. It's very downstream from the economic equality that's encoded into neoliberal kind of law, because ultimately it's a legal framework, which is a very abstract thing that creates this structure, right? Because I mean, what economist in 1970 said, well, I really dream of a world 50 years from now where things are way more unequal. And so, there's all these Nobel Prizes handed out to economists and politicians for their little tweaks and insights. But again, coming back to the meta crisis, it's all for nothing. it's all just pissing in the wind, relatively speaking. So this is why, criticizing over specialization is good. I'm a generalist, but also you need to value the specialization that's out there. So we should be able to build a consensus out of recognizing, like, okay, well, we have solutions to homelessness, and part of that is for each of us to recognize our own ignorance around the subject, right? So as a sociologist, like, I have a few specialties in like kind of knowledge and globalization and conspiracy and stuff, but I'm still going to defer to the actual specialists in those fields, right? That's where I'm getting my general meta perspective from consolidating those experts, those specialists. And so we need to be able to do that. And, you know, Schmachtenberger has this phrase, dynamic subordination. Like, I think I'm doing that better than him, right? I don't think he knows how to do that. You know, if he's taking cues from the Propertarian Institute or from Eric Weinstein or whatever, right? They're kind of compromised by their friendship and by their various professional obligations or expectations. So you know, I do think a lot of the solutions are out there, but it means we have to, you know, increase the signal to noise ratio. We have to admit ignorance and uncertainty, which a lot of these people would comply with. They'd happily comply with, but then we still need to fill in the gaps with very concrete interlocking solutions to these meta problems.
Yeah, for me, it comes back again and again to this sense of a paradigm shift or a transition, because you were talking about somebody saying the system is just doomed. It's just going to go in the wrong direction. And that may be the case, right? I would make a strong argument that the incentive structure of modernity inevitably leads to the destabilization of modernity. It can't do it. But in terms of making that shift, that's also a shift in how we evaluate what expertise is. And we have to get really a lot better at establishing some kind of shared meaning around that, because you're right, we need expertise. There are a lot of solutions. There are a lot of problems that have already been figured out. People don't know how to evaluate those perspectives relative to any other perspective. And they've also, from this new emerging kind of intelligence, they've seen that a lot of things they thought were expertise were not. Like that Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, does an excellent job of going through things, right? Saying, oh, well, the average broker underperforms random chance, that kind of thing, right? But he's getting paid for being an expert. That means he can't doubt it about himself.
Yeah.
There are a lot of areas in which the expertise is not really expertise,
Yeah.
or where the sharing of expertise among experts makes them a little dumber than if they'd held on to their individual expertise. And there's a lot of people who actually do have expertise that are not, they don't give us the feeling of being experts in that area. So it's a really complicated field. And I don't know if we yet have any good strategies for figuring out who's the kind of expert we need and what kind of expertise is bogus expertise in the new system we're talking about.
Yeah. I totally agree. And that's an example of a rational reason to be anti-intellectual, right? To be anti-expert, because experts can be wrong. And this, yeah, speaks to what I meant by the crisis of over-specialization. So, you know, a lot of these experts kind of, they get stuck in a cycle, in a repetitive trap. And I could think of a lot of people who fit this mold, you know, even very dynamic people, they still behave and think in a way that reduces them to a stereotype, right? So Jordan Peterson is one of these people. But there's an article called "The Sameness of Cass Sunstein," and I just love it because Cass Sunstein is one of these award-winning, you know, thinkers. And you know, like you could easily find things to love about him until you make that critical move and start to undermine him, go, oh fuck this guy, you know, he you know, supports this crazy notion, or, you know, he's married to Samantha Power, actually, and, you know, she was part of the Obama administration, and like, well, look how well that went, right? But the article, you know, just to bring it home, was that Cass Sunstein keeps writing the same book. And this is true for so many people, like Richard Dawkins is a kind of classic example, right? Like, thank you, Richard Dawkins, for, introducing the concept of meme and being a public educator and, making atheism more prominent and all these things. But, you could list off his books over the last 2 decades or 3 decades, and they have different titles, but it's the same content rehashed. And maybe to some extent, we could say the same thing about Ken Wilber. But the article made such a good example out of Cass Sunstein for just, the same recycled pap, if you will. That's obvious, like, because he's writing for a public audience too. So it's obviously like, he's an intelligent guy, but it's kind of dumbed down a bit. And then, so every few years, we'll just slap a new title on it and pump it out there. And, you can blame the publisher a little bit. You can blame, this is a systemic thing. It's not just his fault. But I think it's a good example. It speaks to what we're tapping into throughout this conversation about the meta crisis. Do something different.
Yeah,
Engage in autocritique.
There's a lot of meta crisis or trends that are productive of the meta crisis in an ongoing and accelerating way are often generated by people who are insulated from feedback from the world, right? And this is sort of a Nassim Taleb point, right? That if it doesn't affect you, you really don't have intelligence about it. So there's a kind of anti-intellectualism in terms of formal intellect, right? Taleb would say, well, you can't make a decision about going to war with Iran if you've never been to Iran, you've never been in the war, and your kids aren't going. As much as you've learned about Iran, it hasn't gone deep because it doesn't affect you. You're not going to get hit with any of the negatives if it goes wrong. And therefore, you're dumb about it, no matter how well-intentioned or intellectually clever you seem to be. So if we insulate ourselves, if we set up this, you were saying Bezos has nothing to lose, right? That's a Nassim Taleb point as well. His book, Skin in the Game, said what did he say? Thou shalt not achieve anti-fragility at the expense of the fragility of others. Right? Because you can insulate yourself so that almost anything that happens to you works out for you. But in doing that, you set up a situation where other people are fragile to the effects of your decisions, and you are uninformed by the consequences of your decisions. Right? It's not surprising that everybody who votes against public health care is getting public health care. Right? They're not affected by the consequence of their decision. So how could they possibly enact a smart decision if it doesn't viscerally affect them in any way?
Yeah. This speaks to this principle that I'm trying to crystallize and highlight, because that might be how politics works, but it's not. It shouldn't. And I mean, so that's one thing with democracy, but the point you raise speaks to the structural anti-intellectualism of, say, US imperialism itself, right? So you have all this compartmentalization of different people that are tasked to do certain roles, like make decisions to go to war with Iran. And my principle that I keep coming back to is, well, those opportunities shouldn't even exist, right? Because if we had a functional United Nations, then those opportunities wouldn't exist. And so for the U.S. to simultaneously undermine the UN and also to instrumentally declare itself the superpower and the enforcer of global justice and spreading capitalism, we as humans are subject to these processes, right? And this is where my kind of meta perspectives become transformative on the level of first principles, right? And metaphysics, not to get all abstract about it, like another meaning of metaphysics is first principles. So I like to think of it in those terms, actually. And so, metaphysics of global governance, would necessarily, be engaged in dismantling the military industrial complex and the arbitrary politicization of everything, because I want to, change things at the root level. I think we all do, for a paradigm shift, so that those roles, like the person like John Bolton who decides to go to war with Iran or whoever, that they don't exist.
There's
You
a
know, yeah,
there's an interesting thing there about principles, because I think when you critique a structure or a system, like let's say we're critiquing the American Constitution, it's got a whole bunch of advantages, it's got some flaws. You do a critique, and then you think, well, how could we rebuild it from this post-critique perspective? And one of the things it seems to me you'd have to do is really foreground the principles that are behind each of the propositions, right? Because one of the reasons, even if you set up a really good constitution, people will immediately go to work trying to manipulate and dismantle it. And after a couple hundred years, even if it was a great idea, they would have found every loophole they can capitalize on down the line. And so to mitigate that kind of effect, it has to say what the reason is behind the rule. The rule has to state the principle that the rule is based on. Otherwise, if it doesn't, the rule can be contextually negotiated at every subsequent step. There's a sort of thing like, I know that one of the things progressives ought to do, I think, is embrace the conservative idea of legislative simplification. One of the things Trump obviously didn't do, but sounded pretty good, was if you want to introduce a new law, you have to get rid of two laws. He said that before he became president. That's not a bad idea, but it means that the person introducing the new law has to be at a level of abstraction capable of making it account for the work of the other two, right? Like I don't know what the situation is in the States exactly, but in Canada, we decriminalized marijuana. Great. So then there's a set of rules for driving while drunk and a set of rules for driving while stoned, and on down the line. And really, any kind of impairment should be the rule, right? The police should
right.
not be interested in what chemicals in your system. You could be equally impaired by sleep deprivation or legal over-the-counter drugs or emotional upset, right? They should be interested in the functional. A very simple rule would cover impaired driving. But as soon as you start implementing specific rules that proliferate, you get this huge amount of legislative complexity that serves people whose job it is to expertly modulate legislative complexity for people, but it also distances everybody else from the system. So they don't really have an idea of what's going on. So these first principles need to be able to simplify our bureaucracy and legislation, and at the same time need to be able to articulate themselves within the rule so that the rule is more robust against subsequent manipulation attempts.
Yeah, this is a rabbit hole to a whole other subject that I'm passionate about, which is abstraction, and through that, distillation, and especially what you're touching on, it is a great example, because I haven't worked it all out myself yet, but there's this principle of abstract law, and maybe an abstract social contract. Like, this is what it fundamentally attracts me to that. And yeah, we can disagree with Trump's implementation, but the principle is valid there, that law is Byzantine. It's instrumentally like unjust. It serves a power structure, and it's one of the strengths is also one of its weaknesses. It's that it's built on precedent rather than principle. And so, as we become more advanced, we do get better at seeing a way to abstract it. And so I fully agree. Like, all these things need to be simplified, because it's a function of society becoming more complex, is also society becoming more abstract, which is the thesis of this book, The Abstract Society from 1973. And that means it's just too much for any one person to understand. Like, think of all these, speaking of law enforcement, think of all these riot cops that are they're just, um, like Gestapo ultimately. Like, they're not thinking. They're not paid to think. They're not even enforcing the law. They're in fact breaking the law in order to uphold some ideal or some fetish of order, right? And so that's where it becomes fascist. It's like, oh, we just want order above all else. Like, order is justice. But the what I'm saying is the world is so complex, and the social issues are so complex that those cops couldn't possibly comprehend what they're doing, what they're participating in, or else they wouldn't be doing it. But the austerity and economic constriction means that they have to earn a living somehow, and there's only so many jobs. And this brings us back to the meta crisis and metamodernism and paradigm shift, like asking and answering what are the structural minimums that would enable those cops to just walk away from their jobs, or incentivize somebody, what are the principles that it would incentivize a rich stockbroker to just walk away from his job? Because as we've both been saying, like, not only are they inefficient at their jobs, there's something very immoral about a lot of it. So we need to build the system level capacity for everybody to walk away from something bad and towards something good, or at least not harmful. And I think education is such a beautiful answer, because it gives something people to do. It gives them a problem to solve, and it keeps them busy and engaged in potentially meaningful work. And it means that they're not doing something else, like they're not, driving drunk or whatever.
I think of a lot of the root of progressive policy options as an attempt to depressurize and stabilize the population in advance of accumulating and surprising upsets and disruptions that are definitely going to occur. It's not just going to be, financial collapse and COVID in 2020. It's going to be large and periodic, massive disruptions of our system. So we need to lay out the system to handle that. And that means you got to take the pressure off.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of progressive policies that have to do with just that pressure removal. And like you were saying, if you can't really leave your job, it's too pressurized and you're going to make the wrong decision. But also, that's a complete failure of even capitalism, right? There's no real competition if you're stuck in jobs, if they can pay you whatever you want, if you won't have health care if you leave it, if you don't have the mental and emotional freedom to consider another option, right? So unless you have something like a UBI or something like a federal jobs guarantee or some kind of interplay between those things and some kind of universal health care, then the people don't have the freedom to make a decision. And when they don't have that freedom, the institutions and groups they might get involved in have no incentive to actually compete. So you get this non-competitive, insulation-oriented, manipulative form of capitalism rather than an actual capitalism. Not even that capitalism definitely has some structural flaws of its own, but it hasn't even really been allowed to occur because it's been governmentally sabotaged. So that is fascinating to me, and I think it really speaks to the need to implement policies that are universalist in applying to everyone and building nation spirit, but also stabilizing and depressurizing, right? Like, fair enough, people shouldn't be smoking a lot of dope all the time, but taking that pressure off, like not
Yeah.
having everybody looking over their shoulder and thinking they're going to get arrested.
Yeah.
That's one of many areas where we have to take the stress off the system, because the high stress system is not going to operate well when the shock comes, and the shock is coming. lots of them are coming.
Yeah, and you know, the pinkers of the world say everything's getting better, but the critical realists of the world say some things are getting worse. And one of those things is this pressure. And you know, it occurs to me, because there's a lot of obvious research behind this, and my own experience reflects it too, is that, you know, the student experience has gotten more difficult as the decades roll on, because of the economic pressure, right, and the shrinking job opportunities. So you know, it's not just working low wage workers that are suffering. It's even people ostensibly in a privileged position. Like being a student is amazing. It's very privileged, but when you the world makes it more difficult, it prevents those benefits from accruing and multiplying. So you know, I reject any notion of a golden age in history, but things are objectively getting worse on these measures. And you know, just to tell an anecdote, like there's no shortage of examples. But I did a podcast the other day, which was about my self-immolation article. And while I was, you know, talking about that with these guys, and you know, scrolling through research on the internet, I came across a case of a student in France who's 22, and so people self-immolate as protest for all sorts of reasons, right? Like anti-war, like pro-environment, etc. But this kid did it to protest just his conditions as a student, and that he could not afford a cost of living that was like 450 euros a month. You know, there was just a shortfall, and he was desperate, and so he killed himself just because of this. Like it was a very you know, micro localized event to protest his personal situation, but it's also, of course, very structural. And so it always comes back to the same thing, like you're saying, in terms of releasing the pressure. We need to release the pressure on everybody. You know, the students, the cops, you know, of course, the protesters. And again, you know, I'm going to target elites because they have the cushiness, the security, the privilege, to not only make a difference, and to change themselves and change the world, but to do so without you know, undermining their position. You know, I think if they're sincere and they're noble, they would do whatever is true, even if it undermined their position. So, you know, the intellectuals that I admire, like Chris Hedges, like Norman Finkelstein, a lot of people don't even know who they are. And they are world-class intellectuals and critics, and they're people who have suffered. They've been professionally marginalized in their lives, and that is just unacceptable, right? And so, you know, what I think what we're trying to do by discussing this topic explicitly is to try to raise the bar intellectually and normalize, you know, speaking truth to power, and kind of auto critique and self-sacrifice, because it's necessary, you know, because the research we've done, the level of awareness we have about things like climate change, says that, you know, none of that lower tier shit matters. Right? This is the fucking reckoning and the apocalypse, in the sense of like Judgment Day, you know. So when the judgment comes, and it will, you want to be on the right side of history, because there's no afterlife, right? There's just this kind of reality that we share. and that we have a moral obligation, if we really value any of these deep principles of religion or the intellectual spirit, that yeah, you know, there's no, we can't make trade-offs. We need to just have a high standard of truth and trust in public affairs.
Even for people who might socially or intuitively have a strong sense that something in them might live past mortal demise, they still need to privilege the transformation of this world as the kind of moral action that would refine their soul, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think you're right that a big part of this is normalization, right? That there has to be an accelerated shift in what we think of as normal versus radical. That the kinds of things we're talking about are not radical proposals. There just should be the minimum normal kinds of things. Critical thinking, universalized programs. That's not an extraordinary claim for the future. That's just a minimum target to hit, and we have to hit it very soon so that we can go on to see what kind of pasture is available to us beyond that. One thing I wanted to say about the depressurizing is it's not absolute depressurizing, right? It's just a shift. It's setting a new minimum, setting a new floor. Obviously, people need stress, they need challenges, they need responsibilities, they need tasks. It's not about just existing in an absolute world of no pressure. Just like reformulating the way equity is distributed in society doesn't mean perfectly equal results. It means, in a sense, a return to normal inequity, right? That there's the famous thing, you can do it with humans or you can do it with chimps, where one of them gets to offer a percentage of the resources to the other and the other gets to say yes or no. And if they get offered something less than 30%, they usually say no. That's instinctively too big a differential. Might as well blow it up, right? Books like The Spirit Level touch on that, that if the differential itself is too big, a strange kind of stress permutates through the system. And so it's not that we're going to get rid of a spectrum of results. There's going to be differentials, but those differentials are distinguished between a normal range and a massively exaggerated range that puts the whole system out of whack and triggers everybody's evolved inbuilt instinct about what is a normal range of skewing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it you know, it reminds me of a trap we should be wary of, and perhaps this is a good point to kind of to wind down on. But like the Nordic countries, you know, are kind of role models of, you know, the welfare state and of human development in a sense. But that doesn't stop, you know, them from having high suicide rates. So, you know, there's another crisis that emerges when people have their basic needs met. It's kind of existential issues, right? And you know, knowing that means we can prepare for that, right? It can be built into our meta solutions, which is why Hansi does it by having a kind of existential politics. um, but yeah, it's about establishing that baseline. Um, so you know, when you meet all your material needs, there's still work to be done. And so that's the human condition, and that should be a, you know, common ground for us as a cosmopolitan society to, you know, just be realistic about that and have that be part of the organizing principle that you know, there's always work to be done. And I think through education you give people the necessary foundation and common knowledge, but also if it's done right, you you inspire people to value that challenge and to value education in itself. So it becomes a kind of you know, automatic and recursive process. That's the effect education had on me, but that's a very particular type of education too, and it needs to be universalized.
There's a good argument that in order to address the meta crisis, you have to address the meaning crisis first, because people have to figure out what's going on and have the sense of meaningfulness in common to mobilize themselves. But meaning is something that's a couple levels up on the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, right? So in order to address the meaning crisis, you've got to really have a lot more people scoring well on those first couple of levels of needs. Otherwise, they're not available to even approach the meaning problem, which means they're not available to approach the meta crisis. So you've got to have a huge percentage of people sufficiently meeting those first couple of levels of needs so they're available for higher needs work. Otherwise, you're not going to have the legion of people you need dealing with meaning, or the legion of people you need dealing with the unfolding crises we face.
Yeah. Let me close on the point that it's been kind of a through line today, but the anti-intellectualism is really built in to the system, in the sense that, like, for example, we know that empowering women, giving them equal rights and giving them money and autonomy, not only is it the right thing to do, but it has positive sociological effects, right? So birth rates will decrease, right? And that's really important for kind of public health and for subverting the meta crisis, right? So we know this, but it's hard. It's been hard to normalize and institute, because of a kind of entrenched and subtle patriarchy and anti-intellectualism. So this is why it's so pervasive, and why it's a root cause of the meta crisis that needs to be reversed.
Well, I hope that I'm getting better and better at being interested in the ways that I don't want to know things. It's been a fun conversation. I can't believe
Yeah.
we went 2 hours.
Yeah. Thanks again, and we'll see y'all next time.
Looking forward to it.